morning. I want to share with you how, after having had a spiritual awakening and made a decision to become willing to seek only God's will in my life, I ended up in prison in what I felt was a life-threatening situation. And what happens when God shows up? And aren't you glad I'm not as dramatic as I was when I first came into Al-Anon? But anyway, I like to start here because recovery's already happened. I've had the spiritual awakening, and this is about 3.5 years into my recovery. And the spiritual awakening happened because my sponsor suggested that perhaps we should work the steps again. And of course, I was gravely insulted because I thought the first time we worked them, I was doing him a favor. I thought sponsors got credit for working the steps, and I didn't want to, take away anything from them, because I had actually worked the steps my first time 10 years before I realized there were meetings. I'll get into that later, but I'd found out about the 12 steps. I had a spiritual director, and we worked them. And my life did get better, but so anyway, when I came in, I thought I was kind of doing the graduate program. So my sponsor said, work them, sure, So I knew how to work them. I'd done it once before, so I didn't bother talking to him about it. We just sat down and did the deal. So he asked me to do it again, and I resisted for about 9 months, and finally I caved in. And we did it, and I did just one slightly thing different. I actually listened to him and followed directions. And I was with a group of guys doing it, and we were blowing through the steps. We did them in 4 weeks. We didn't complete our 9-step amends, but we started them. And I had that significant spiritual awakening you read about. It wasn't the gradual type. It was like, boom. And some weeks after that, I said, wow, that was really amazing. Maybe I should listen to direction more often. So I was doing my 11th step and made this deal with God that I said, if I'm ever asked to do anything again in recovery, first I'll say yes. Second, I'll say yes right away. I won't wait 9 months. And third, I won't have a resentment about it, because one of my little habits is that whenever I'm asked to do anything, I get resentful about you for putting stuff on me. So anyway, most of my recovery has happened through resentments. So shortly after this, and one of the challenges I'd had was there wasn't great recovery in my home group when I started. There is now, but when I started, a lot of the long-timers there were just miserable. And I didn't want to I figured out that I'd need to hang around here for the rest of my life if I wanted to get better, but I didn't want to be like them. So I started looking for people who had long-term recovery. And I found those long-termers who had 30, 40 years with smiles on their face. That was a clue. And started connecting up with them. So I was always interested in hearing long-term recovery. And shortly after I made that prayer to God, this gentleman came to visit Richmond, who had gotten sober the same week as Bill W., which was 68 years at that point. And I figured I wasn't going to hear too much longer recovery than that, so I decided to go hear him. So about 300 of us showed up. He'd actually come down to help out with the jail ministry. A group had decided to take a meeting into the jails, very much like he experienced AA doing when AA was first founded. So he wanted to come down and support that. So he got up there and talked, and of course there was a catch. They were trying to get people to come help them take the meetings to the jail. And like I said, there are about 300 of us. I'm in the back. And I go isn't this wonderful? I've made this, deal with my higher power that I'll do whatever I'm asked to do. I'll do it right away, and I won't have a resentment. And the first thing that happens is something I can't do, because I'm an Al-Anon, right? I go to meetings, so I don't try to help alcoholics. But I did say I would do it, so I get to go up front, which is really important if you understand people like me. So I get to look good, go up front when they called everybody up, and I don't have to do it. So I got up there. I think I was the only one who came up. And there's this wonderful guy from AA who's sitting there. And he gives me the deal about how, we got to get your background check, and we'll do this. It'll take a couple of weeks, come to my house, everything. I said, I'd love to do that, but I can't. He goes, why not? I said, I'm an Al-Anon. And he had never heard that excuse before. Because he kind of went, well, it's the same disease, so just come and share your experience, strength, and hope. And that promise I'd made about not having resentment, right out the window. And I'm like, great, now I got to go to jail with all the drunks and alcoholics, or with all the drunks and addicts who did this to me. I was a picture of health. But fortunately, we had we had to go through the process because you got to get background checked and stuff. I evidently was one of the ones who flew through because I didn't have anything in my background that needed to be checked. But I was very perturbed by this because what am I going to bring? Why am I doing this? So I prayed to God, and God said go 4 times. And I figured that what this was going to be about was I was going to get to meet these guys who took meetings into prisons, and that's those type of guys have a very good level of recovery that I would benefit from. So I figured that's what it was about. So I went there the first time and did it on a Sunday. Took a couple hours. It was about 80 guys. It was a special wing. They called it a pod. And these guys were hardcore because all they did was 12-step recovery. I mean, they had 3 hours of meals a day, 1 hour of exercise, 8 hours of sleep. But other than that, they were working at 12 steps. And it took them 2.5 days to get through the 12 steps. And what they did after that is they switched sponsors and did it again. And they had meetings stuff. They'd have meetings, and a lot of them were speaker meetings. So these guys knew each other very well. And I was shocked going through this day with them, or part of a day with them, because as they were speaking, I was relating in. Usually when I went to an AA meeting, I was judging everybody about how much better I was than they. And these guys, they were an interesting group. There was vehicular manslaughter and drug dealing. My favorite one, because this is in the pre-Breaking Bad days, was the guy who ran the meth lab, because I didn't know how to do that, and he told me all about it. It was great. These aren't the type of people I normally associated with. So going on. Well, I came back the next week, and I guess because they knew each other so well that if you come back, you're qualified to be a speaker. So they got up for the speaker meeting part, and they said, "Let the new guy talk." Right? And I'm like, "Okay, I've done this before." So I got up, and one of the things I learned in Richmond when I went to open AA meetings is always to introduce myself by, "Hi, my name is Brook. I'm an Al-Anon." Because I found that if they, at the beginning of the meeting, says, "Anybody visiting or here for their very first meeting, we'd like to welcome you." And I said, "Hi, my name is Brook," and didn't say anything after that, I ran into these very nice gentlemen after the meeting who informed me they were not my sponsor. And what we were going to do next is, and I found that's a really bad time to have a discussion about how I don't have a drinking problem. So anyway, I head that off with, "Hi, I'm Brook. I'm an Al-Anon." And these guys, as I kind of tried to indicate, were very serious about recovery and very respectful. So I was very shocked when Pat, could you raise your hand? My friend Pat here has volunteered to help out. A gentleman sitting here, there were about 80 guys in the pods, was just about the two sections here where, and I started speaking, and I said, "Hi, my name is Brook, I'm Al-Anon," and the gentleman where Pat was sitting. Now, this guy was from the country, backwoods country, so he had a thick accent that was hard to understand, and he just said, "Excuse me, what's Al who?" And I did exactly what you did. And I said, "Excuse me, sir?" And he said, "What's Al who?" And I'm wondering if this is like a prison joke, the new guy, and I'm like, "I'm sorry, sir, I can't understand you." And he said, "Look, I know what an addict is, I know what an alcoholic is. You said you're Al who? What's that?" And I went, "Al-Anon?" And he goes, "Yeah, what's that?" And so I read the preamble that you just heard. And that happened. It got really quiet. But not in the good way, really quiet. It got quiet in the way of, "Oh my God, I've just told the enemy I'm on the other side." And I'll explain to you the thought process that went on in my mind. I'm going like, the other thing, the next thought that came to my mind is you have to sign forms when you go into jail in Virginia. And a lot of forms, but one of them basically says, if something happens, we're not coming to get you, right? So I look around for the guard, and he's not in the pod anymore. I look around for the guy who brought me, and he's in a separate room counseling somebody one-on-one. I look out at the enemy now, and there's 80 of these guys. I go like, no problem, I was in the Marine Corps. I'll be able to help them for about, a fraction of a second. So all this must have happened very quickly, because I was about to really lose it. And that guy said, "You mean there's something out there for our wives and kids?" And I was able to say yes. You know, in a million years, if you give me a million years before I went there, I never would have come up with the solution that I had hope. To share with those guys. I thought I was entirely doing that for me. But that's what it's like when God shows up. And all I needed was just a little bit of willingness. Crack the door for God to walk through. And I like to start that way because I need that reminder all the time. Because I go to selfish and self-centered very easily. And anyway, my name is Brook. I'm from Richmond, Virginia. My home group is the Tuesday night adult children meeting in the west end of Richmond. If you ever find yourself in Richmond on a Tuesday night at 7:30, please come join us. Be prepared to stay for an hour and a half, though, because we're a speaker and a discussion meeting. But we love to have guests. And I want to thank Teresa for inviting me, and Monique and Tiffany for hosting us. We had a great time. I am glad they don't have scales in my room, so I don't know how much I've gained weight, but we'll find out when I get home. And I think the committee has done a wonderful job. I mean, there are a lot of people here. This is incredible. Let's hear it for them. They have done a great job. You know, when I first started getting asked to speak in a more formal setting than my home group, I always thought it would be fun because, you know, I'd heard all you got to do is get there and tell about what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now. And fortunately, I have friends in AA who grabbed me very quickly after they heard me doing this, because when I thought about it, what it was like, well, what you guys did to me, what happened, well, how I am a victim, and what it's like now, how I've overcome being, you know. So they stopped me real quick and said, no, it's what we were like, what happened, and what we're like now. Because if we do it that way, I have to admit to you that I was self-centered, cruel, sarcastic, consumed with fear and rage, but I would have tried to convince you I was a nice guy because what you thought about me was real important. And, you know, that kind of developed by growing up in a family affected by alcoholism. I didn't know that at the time. I grew up outside of Washington, D.C., and there were 4 major things that, you know, permeated my family. I mean, my part in the family, I should say. And that was, mentioned the alcoholic family. I had a real bad learning disability, which made school kind of tough. I did have a great relationship with God, though. This is my second time in Al-Anon. First time didn't take. But I would have made it to Al-Anon once, much less twice, without God doing a lot of things for me that I wasn't able to do for myself, and I was completely unaware of that. But the other thing I had that you guys may be a little familiar with is I had a plan. You guys ever run into an unrecovered Al-Anon with a plan? Yeah, we make life interesting, don't we? Yeah. Anyway, and my plan was I was going to grow up, join the military when I was 18 so I could be completely self-supporting and, you know, turn my back on those people and I'd be fine because they were the problem and I'd be fine on my own. I was really disappointed when I got to a meeting and one long-timer after about 2 months of me sitting there when they were asking how he's doing, saying, I'm fine. They explained to me what the acronym FINE meant. If you want to know what it means, let's talk after the meeting because I don't want to swear from the podium. But anyway, but just to describe kind of how it affected me, because I don't know what it was like, because what it was like Tuesday. Just every day was like this. But there is one story that was kind of unusual, but it kind of shows how the growing up like this affected me. And I was 7 or 8, second, third grade, something like that. I was walking to school, walked around a big circle up in D.C. There are lots of them. And as I was going around the circle, crossing all the traffic, I was going to school the way I always did. And then something happened. But the way I went to school is when my left foot hit the ground, I said, I'm dumb. And my right foot hit the ground, I said, I'm stupid. And I used to walk to school and from school like that every day. And this day was different because as I was doing it, as I was going around one of the corners, I heard this voice behind me that said, "No!" And I stopped, and I spun around, and there was nothing there. And I started thinking about that. But you know, I went the rest of the way to school that day and home without saying I'm dumb, I'm stupid. I was thinking about that voice. And I believe today that was the first time I was aware of my higher power doing for me what I couldn't do for myself. You know, today, I get the privilege of working with kids who struggle in school. And if I'd ever caught one of my kids talking to themselves that way, I would have grabbed them and shaken them, because it wasn't true. It wasn't true for them. It wasn't true for me. But I didn't have anybody in my life to do that for me at that point. So, well, what happened? Well, I grew up, put my plan into action. I actually ended up going to the Naval Academy, figuring that once I'm there, I'll be fine. And I wasn't. And so I figured, well, something was wrong. You know, I need to get better grades. I need to get on a team. I need to do this, and all that stuff. Nothing made a dent in it. And finally, I figured out what the real problem was. The problem, I was at the Naval Academy, and I was in the Navy. I needed to be in the Marine Corps. And once I got into the Marine Corps, you know, and you can imagine what happened. So, well, when I was in the Marine Corps, you know, she happened to me. One of the many she's, but this is the one that, you know, God again was there. And yeah, I'd broken up with her 5 months before this phone call came. And the interesting thing about that statement is I said, I broke up with her. Because I didn't break up with people. I hung in there till the bitter end, you know, and I broke up because I realized how sick the relationship was. So you can imagine if I figured out this thing was sick, it was a nightmare. Anyway, so it's 1989, Martin Luther King holiday. It's, you know, Monday morning, about 1 in the morning, my phone starts ringing. And I was a company commander at this point. And I had learned, I got one of the early versions of voicemail, because I realized it's a real good thing when the phone rings that late at night not to pick up, but to let it go to voicemail, hear what happened, so you can make some decisions before you call back and tell what to do. And it was weird because there was no voice message. And that happened about 20, maybe 25 times. Finally, there was a voice message. And it was not the woman I'm talking about, it was one of her friends who said, "You need to go bail her out of jail. She's down in the San Diego jail. You need to get bail and go bail her out." And I remember sitting there going like, wow, that's too bad for her, because in my job, I put people in jail for drugs and alcohol. I do not go get them out. And I said that as I got out of bed, got my clothes on, found a bail bondsman, all the time saying, I don't have to do this. Found out where the girls. Now, you know, for those of you who are in AA, you may not realize that those of us who are not in AA don't automatically know where the jail is. We don't have people who help us find out where it is. We have to, and this is the pre-Google days. You know, there's no internet. I can't look, you know. Anyway, so I had to find out where the jail was. So all this took about 2 hours. You know, so I'm now driving. I'm in San Diego. I was in San Diego at this point. So I'm on I-5 driving south to the jail at 3 in the morning. And I've had 2 hours alone with the committee in my head. You can imagine how crazy I'm going right now. So just to shut everything up, I turned on talk radio. And you guys know what talk radio is like at 3 in the morning. And there's this interesting woman talking about this book she's just written on codependency. And thus began my journey, because I went out and got the book the next day. You know, found the 12 Steps of Alcoholics Anonymous in there. I missed the part about meetings. I read the book. I've read it since then. It's in there. I don't know how I missed it, but you know, well, there was another part. I started working. There was another part I worked in, because it seems like we got a good chunk of long-time recovery in here. You guys remember the term family of origin work? Yeah. I thought that was a real interesting idea. The idea was that you had to go back into your family of origin where you grew up with to find out where this came from. I'm going like, oh, this will be really good. So I started making phone calls to my family. And my family, we believe in the geographical cure. We were all over the country, and we suddenly decided we were going to have a family reunion. And I did not realize that I was the topic of the family reunion. And I like to refer to this week as the reverse intervention. You know, those of you who might be involved in an intervention, that's when people get together and explain to them how they've their drinking or their drugging has affected their lives and they need to do something about it. Mine was the opposite. They were talking about how my phone calls and talking about this stuff were ruining the family, and although they agreed I had a problem, they informed me I did not get it in our family, and to knock it off. And I used to hate my family for that, because I almost died when I was looking for the solution. And I thought these people were trying to kill me. I didn't realize that they were suffering from this family disease of alcoholism. And the best way I can describe that, I grew up in Maryland. Anybody here ever been crabbing? Okay, let me just explain what it is. A couple things you need. It's pretty low tech. You just need a chicken neck, a piece of string, but you do need a 12 quart granite pot with a lid. Because that's when you catch them. You get on a pier, throw it up, crabs grab it, you pull them in, you throw them in the pot, and you put the lid on real quick. Because if you don't put the lid on real quick, they scamper out and go back in. And so you do that, you get the second one, lid up, close it real quick. Well, when you get the third one, you pull it up, throw it in there, you don't need to put the lid back on. See, because when there are three of them in there, one of them tries to get out, the other two try to get out with them, they reach up and pull them back in. They are not trying to kill that first crab. They're trying to escape themselves. But that's what it looks like. And that, to me, is a great description of what the family disease of alcoholism looks like. And, alcoholism doesn't just come for the alcoholic. It comes for the whole family. It wants us all suffering or dead. And that's a really good reminder to me. And what happened to me is, over time, and going to paid professionals to try to figure out what's going on, and, people in the church who were trying to help me out and stuff like that. I remember one time my spiritual director suggested that I go to a therapist. In my family, that was, I don't know, he might as well say you should go out and molest children. It was that you were such a loser if you went there. And finally, I was so beaten down, I went, and I'm in this guy's office, and I think it's, about 7 minutes in, and he's sitting there going, "You ever heard of Al-Anon?" And I'm like, who? I had never heard of it. And the funny thing is, in the military, I had training in how to intervene in alcoholics, because we have that problem in the military. And the protocols they gave me were phenomenal, because if I was left to my own devices, I would still have people living in my house that I was trying to help who I met in the military. But they taught us how to. There was no mention of Al-Anon, at least none that I remember. Thus started my journey the first time. That didn't take. So went out there, and the only thing that came out of working with that guy is he uncovered a lot of stuff, but there was no solution that I could access. And he showed me how the woman I was dating at the time, and we were thinking about getting married, how badly I was treating her. And I had sworn I would never treat another individual like the way I'd been treating growing up. And I couldn't stop. And the only solution I could come up with to stop harming her was to kill myself. Well, there was a problem with that. Not how to do it. I had a little training in that. It was, I said that good relationship I had with God. Well, that came from my faith tradition. And, in my faith tradition, we're not allowed to kill ourselves, because we don't belong to ourselves. We belong to God. However, there is an exception. If you're crazy, you're not responsible for doing it. Well, how do you know when you're crazy? Well, for those of you who are wondering, I've got an answer for you. I came up with a plan. If I held on long enough before I blew my brains out, I figured I'd cross the threshold into crazy, and I'd get to go to the good place, not the bad place. Thus began one of the longest years of my life. I was sitting there all the time. Can I do it now? No. Can I do it now? Can I hold on a little longer? It was just agony. And fortunately, in my faith tradition's calendar every year, we have this 6-week period where everybody worldwide gets together and tries to improve their relationship with their higher power. And so, I've been getting ready to kill myself for about 10 months now, and so I decided to ask God what He wants me to do. And God asked me to get a dog. Now, I'd always wanted a dog. We couldn't have one in our family because, there was alcoholism there. There wasn't room for anything else other than what we had. So that couldn't happen. So I finally, I was at a point now where I could get a dog, but I was going to kill myself. And, if I killed myself, I'd abandon this dog. And that was cruel. And God, you must be cruel to do that. And unfortunately for me, my higher power knows how to detach. And so when I started arguing with God about that, the response I got back was, you asked, I told you what I want you to do, the rest is up to you. I don't know if you know how infuriating that is if you're on the receiving end of that, because then it's all left on me, and I'm feeling, fine, I'll do it, right? So searched around, found a breeder. I love German Shepherds. I'd always wanted a German Shepherd. So found a breeder of German Shepherds. She decided that it would be better for me to I was looking for a mature dog, an older dog, rather than a puppy because I wanted to bring it to work. And anyway, so she said, well, I'm looking for a good home for my 2-year-old German Shepherd. Why don't you get her? So we did it. I gave her a call. She said, okay, why don't you come pick it up? I said, how about Monday? I said, nah, how about Friday? She goes, no, I can't do it. The earliest I could do it is Sunday morning. I went, sure, let's do that. And that was Easter morning. And in my faith tradition, Easter is a significant event about, resurrection from the dead, being brought back to life, that kind of thing. And I'm sitting going, I wonder if this is significant. My higher power is not subtle when I'm having trouble. So I went and picked up the dog. One thing I did not think about was this was a 2-year-old dog who had been this breeder's pet and had, been with her for 2 years. And so to the dog, this looked like this stranger's coming to kidnap me. And so, we try to get her in the car. She's not. Her name was Dee. Dee is not coming. And so we're trying to of course, the breeder starts crying because this has been her pet for 2 years. So we finally get this dog in there. The dog is leaning up against the window, shaking. And I've got a 45-minute drive home. I've got one hand on the dog. I'm driving. And I'm thinking, God, the plan's going well. We get home. I've got a fairly, modest-sized home. It's only 1,000 square feet. And whatever part of the house I'm in, Dee is on the other part. She's getting as far away from me as possible. And so I go to sleep that night. And, she's in the laundry room. I've got wood floors and a tile laundry room, so I can hear where she's going. So she's in the laundry room, as far away as she can from me. I lay down my head and say, God, now I'm suicidal, and the dog hates me. Great plan. About 3 o'clock in the morning, I hear this crash. It sounds like all the cabinets in the laundry room have collapsed. And I hear Dee coming down the hallway with her little claws. And she came by the side of my bed, looked up at me, laid down, and didn't leave my side for the rest of her life. But something was wrong when I went to work the next day. I took Dee with me because, I wasn't going to abandon her, right? So I checked out with work. They said she could do it. Couldn't figure out. Something was off. Monday happened. Tuesday happened. I'm halfway through Wednesday before I was able to identify what was wrong. I hadn't had a suicidal thought in 3 days. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I went to a couple paid professionals, went to a lot of, clergy and that type of people, and no one had the suggestion of get a dog. But God did. God knew that unconditional love would break through. Well, what I do after that, it's, I had a lot of time on my hands because when you're sitting there thinking about killing yourself for a year, you don't have a lot of free time. And now I suddenly had a bunch because it was just removed suddenly. And so I didn't ask God what to do now. I got it from here. So it only took me about another 4 or 5 years, about 4 years before I crashed and burned again and crawled into my now home group. And the different thing is here, my home group has one reading we do every week. It's there's an Al-Anon 20-question pamphlet about did you grow up with a problem drinker? And so they're reading it. I'm counting. I've only got 18 out of the 20. Well, I was lying about 2 of them, but I fully expected at the end for them to get there and go like, oh, 18 out of 20. Oh, you don't need to stay here. No, thanks for coming. We really appreciate you being here, but no, you don't need to come. And at the end of it, it says, if you have any one of these, Al-Anon may help. And I was going like, oh, I'm screwed. And I was so wrong, because I'd finally found a place. I mean, the only other thing that was weird was all the laughter. It's like, what are these people laughing about? They obviously do not have the problems I have. And then I heard some of their stories. And some of these people had far worse problems than I did. And I really wanted to know what they knew. And, it occurred to me that there are people in my home group who were there when I came in. So a few years back, I asked them what I was like. And I was surprised by the reaction, because it was not what they told me. But they didn't want to tell me because they were afraid it might hurt up our relationship. Well, no one was cared about hurting relationships with me when I came in, because I was problem-oriented. I was outwardly focused. I was not comfortable in my own skin. I controlled conversations with my knowledge. I periodically would go on full alert if things or people got too close. I didn't listen well. I was into drama and gossip, but I would try to convince you I was a nice guy, because what you thought of me was important. So I started in Al-Anon, and you heard about the first couple of years. I had another relationship or 2 in me, so I didn't quite start right. But after I worked the steps and had the spiritual awakening, I was off to the races. And suddenly that sponsor I'd been trying to get run my life for me, who wouldn't give me any advice at all, was full of suggestions. Like, maybe it'd be a good idea for you to be the GR for the group. And I was insulted, because in the 2.5, 3 years I'd been in the group, we hadn't had a GR. We'd had 5. And the way you became GR in a group is during the announcements. Anybody got an announcement? Yeah, I want to be GR. We'd vote them in. Yay! And 2 months later, they would leave. So I figured that was the formal way you quit recovery. And was wondering if my sponsor was trying to give me a hint. But I decided to take it on because our group had problems, and I was the man to solve the problems. And once my sponsor got wind of that, he just said, let's go to the district and start finding out what this is about, and introduce me to the traditions. And thus started my thing. And I've held a lot of elected positions, district, a couple jobs at the state level. It's been really helpful for me in learning how to apply the traditions with you guys. And then, once I learned that, I can apply them in my personal life. And that has gotten a lot better too. And one of the big things that happened was I mentioned that we started working the 9th step, but I didn't complete the 9th step when we worked the steps in 4 weeks. And I used to joke about how the 8th step was my favorite step because I stayed there so long. Because I was terrified that if I told my sponsor what I needed to do for making amends, he'd make me do it. And that would be dangerous. And so, I didn't realize I was doing what the 8th step said. I was becoming entirely ready. And I finally heard what I needed to hear. I was at a meeting one time, and this, you know how irritating newcomers who work the steps are. They're going like, oh, I'm joyous and free. I'm like, yeah, you're on a pink cloud. Wait till you hang around like I did, and you'll be miserable like me. And she's going like, oh yeah, I just blew through the steps. I'm going, I just blew through the amends. I'm going like, how did you do that? And she goes, well, I sat down with my sponsor, and we went through my 4-step inventory, and I said I need to make these amends, and she started crossing stuff out. I said, what do you mean, crossing stuff out? She goes like, well, I had stuff down there that didn't need to be on there, so she crossed it off, and we didn't do that. I said, like, they can cross stuff off? And she goes, yeah. I said, what is that like? And she was like, well, I sat there, and I said, like, well, I had a big argument with my brother, and I stopped talking to him. And her sponsor goes like, well, when's the last time you talked to him? He goes like, well, last week. She crossed it off because you obviously have made amends, you're talking to him again. So I'm like, wow. So the next day I got on the phone with my sponsor, figuring that he crossed stuff off for me too, and he did. All the stuff I didn't want crossed off. But the last thing I told him about was my fear about making amends to my mother, because I don't know about you guys, but I'm a firm believer in the slogan that if it's not one thing, it's your mother. And that's been a huge challenge in my recovery, and I was terrified that if I made amends to her about my part in it, she would take that knowledge and beat me up with it for the rest of my life. And my sponsor had met my mother, and he just said, that is a good insight. So you don't have to do that. I'm like, yes! And he goes, however, there's a thing called living amends. I'm going like, what? he goes like, well, let's talk about this. And he says, where do these interactions usually happen? I said, well, it's usually on the phone. And he goes, how has this happened? Well, I call her every 2 weeks. Like, okay. Well, the reason you're not going to make amends to her, the reason you're not going to tell her that stuff is because she would, as you said, use that information to beat you up, and that would be bad for her. So we're not going to do that. I'm going like, bad for her? What about me? Well, you've already heard about unreasonable sponsorship before, so, and I'm going like, he goes like, well, okay, what's this living amends thing? He goes like, well, you are not going to let her treat you badly on the phone anymore. That's going to be your living amends. I'm like, that is impossible. I've been trying for decades to do that. And he said, well, let's figure it out. I'm going like, okay, fine. He goes like, okay, you play your mom, I'll play you, and we'll have a phone conversation. For the next 30 minutes, I ripped him to shreds. And he finally came up with an expression that diffused everything. And what it was, as soon as I started getting negative with him, or as soon as my mom started getting negative, the phrase was, oh, I just remembered I have to go. Click. Now this part of my amends to my family earlier had been that I wouldn't lie anymore. So I couldn't sit there and make something up. But he goes, yeah, if things are going south, you need to get off the phone. And I can remember the conversation within a couple of weeks of that, of me calling my mother, her getting on the phone, starting right away, and me going like, oh, I just remembered, I have to go. And she goes, you called me? I said, I know, click. And it was like, I don't know, 10, 12 weeks later, she stopped doing that. She stopped being negative when we were talking. I don't know, I know she still did it. She didn't do it with me, and I don't care who she went to do it with, not me. My life got a lot better, and I'm sitting there going like, this sponsor's a genius. I went up and I go like, how can I go to sponsorship school? I want to learn more about this stuff. And he goes, just keep coming back, it'll happen. And I thought he was a genius, and really, now I know him better. He was like me. He didn't have a clue, but he realized the only option he had when we got to that point was to reason things out with someone else and hope God showed up. And God did. And one of my favorite lines in our literature is in How Al-Anon Works. It's that very last sentence of our first chapter. And it says, we come to Al-Anon for many different reasons, but we stay for only one. We want our lives to get better. And for those first couple of years in it, my life wasn't necessarily getting that much better. It kind of came and plateaued. And I've seen lots of people who kind of done the same thing I did, plateaued, and then they just kind of drift out the doors. And I've had the friends who've committed suicide. Alcoholism is a deadly disease. If you're not progressing, I would suggest you find someone to work with, preferably someone that, like I found, who was smiling and seemed to have a happy life, because they know something. And we get credit for helping you out. Well, anyway, so what am I like now? Well, I like to think I'm useful. I think one of the best examples of that is my mom. As part of that 9th step, our relationship got better. Didn't get perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the things I live in Richmond, Virginia. She was living up in Washington D.C. still in the house she lived in, and my mom graciously decided, after living in her house for 50 years, it was time to downsize and move into an apartment. And she did that before there was a crisis and forced the family to get involved in it. And so she asked me to come up and help her with the move to an apartment. It was literally within walking distance of school. It was the same path I used to take to. There was an apartment complex attached to our church, and she was going to move in there because her life centered around her church. And I said yes, because I've made a promise I'm going to help, whenever I asked to do each service. But that resentment thing, I was resenting up there. I was sitting there going like, I'm the only one stupid enough to live close up to Mom, so I have to help her do this. So I'm sitting there, but I know how to do it. So, I'm doing the sandwich thing. I'm going to more meetings beforehand. I'm calling people before I go. I've got appointments set up afterwards. And, I figured I was being pretty virtuous, so I called my sponsor right before I went up and telling him about what a victim I am because I got to go help my mom and, whine. And, he sits there and goes like, isn't it wonderful you can be of service to your family? And my thought was, no, this sucks. But after years of practice, I've learned not to say stuff like that to my sponsor because I know what happens afterwards. So anyway, I thought about that. And I thought about people in the program who have been evicted from their homes in July and August who I helped move on an afternoon with a bunch of other people in recovery. And I was happy to do it because I knew giving service like that would be good for me. Here's my mom, who's doing us a favor. Oh, I also forgot about I didn't tell you about the fact that my sister from Milwaukee had come out and was with my mom for the whole week helping her move. So yeah, I'm really the victim. But I was sitting there driving up going like, wow, what's wrong with me? And finally, I had the right question. And stuff started being lifted off. And then 2 years later, when my mom decided it was time to move into assisted living, she decided to move out with my sister, but asked me to help drive her out. And I said yes. And again, it was 2.5 days driving out. And I was going like, how can I survive in the car with them? And I just said, I went and got audiobooks from the library. And we listened to them on the way. And we had a great trip. And then a couple... anyway, so let me tell you about the last time I saw my mom. Alzheimer's runs in my family. It kind of goes there with alcoholism. It's on both sides, rampant. And so I went to visit her in this is the summer of 2016, what very well could have been the last time I saw her. My wife and I went out, and we visited her, and she was non-communicative that weekend, but when time to leave, and as we were getting ready to leave, my mom was having lunch, and I just said, see you later, Mom, and we walked out. And as I was walking down the hallway with my wife and my sister, I realized that might not be true. I might not see her again. Well, what do you do in that situation? You guys have heard that looking bad is something I worry about. And I'm like, well, if I just go back, I'm going to look bad here. If I go out, I'm going to feel bad. I'm just starting to get the committee going about this. And I realize, what do you do when you're wrong? You promptly admit it and make amends. What amends could I make? I told my sister and my wife, excuse me, I'll be right back. Went to my mom, kissed her, and said, I love you. Her friend at the table's beaming about the little son. I do not have the story about making a graveside amends with somebody I'm trying to figure out how to fix this. Because you guys taught me what to do in the moment, how to live. I thought working these steps was punishing. I didn't realize it was teaching me a way of living that would be so much better than I could have imagined. Now let me tell you what happened at the graveside when we buried her. Because after she died, we took 5 months to bury my mother because, it was interfering with people's vacations and it was So anyway, there were 50 of us there, the big extended family. And they asked me to conduct the service. And as we're walking down to the gravesite, because this is where my dad was buried, I was walking with my brother, who I'd also had a troubled relationship with, and he kind of froze up and he said, I don't know if I can go here. I said, why not? He goes like, I haven't been to Dad's gravesite since we buried him, like 14 years earlier. And I said, that's okay, I haven't been either. And he goes, no, I've had a chance. His kids lived in New York City. This is where my parents were in. Anyway, I'll talk about that a little bit. And I realized I was about to argue with him, because that's what we do, right? Family, you tell them what to do. And I realized, oh, this is what it looks like if you haven't made amends. And I was clear. And I went there, conducted the service. The only thing I was worried about was at the end of the service, we were going to sing Amazing Grace because that's something everybody knew. And I was worried I'd be too choked up. Wasn't even thinking about the fact one of my cousins has starred on Broadway. So all I did is the next thing. I started trying to sing before I got too choked up. And she, carried the tune. And, it just continually amazes me that all I have to do is show up and just do the next thing. And how wonderful it turns out. I mean, everybody was thanking me about the wonderful service. I'm just glad I got through it. There was only one problem I've had since really things have smoothed out with my family, and that's my niece and nephews. Because, this is a disease that progresses. And it was okay when they were kids. When they were teenagers, it was just good stories. Then they hit their 20s, and now in their 30s, and things are tough. It's just tough to be around them. I heard somebody talk about, people affected by the disease of alcoholism are killing themselves on the installment plan, and that's really hard to watch. And I didn't know how that was going to get taken care of. And so the next thing to do was when my mom moved out to Milwaukee with my sister, I visited them the first Christmas that she was there because she didn't have her support network anymore. And so, my sister suggested that we go out and, go to lunch. And so I'm driving. Mom and my sister are helping me. So I'm like, going like, we need to get to the restaurant fast. I need to make a call. And my mom, in an offhanded comment, just goes like, she was talking about my dad's drinking. And goes like, after all, he was so careful about what he drank because he didn't want to turn into a hopeless alcoholic like his dad, who had to help start AA before he could get sober. And I'm like, what? Because part of my amends to my family after the reverse intervention, my part in it, was that I don't bring up recovery. I just do what I do. And figured that they were doing it. I've been shocked that they haven't come up to me and go like, Brook, you're such a spiritual giant now. What's going on? We want to know. They are just glad I'm no longer contributing to the problem. They're fine with that. But, how do you find out about that? Because I'm, part of my amends is not to create turbulence, and that might do damage if I start asking about grandfather. And again, I'm sitting there going like, well, they did say he got sober in the 30s, and he did live in New York City, and they had a country home. This is where my parents were buried, up in Bedford Hills, which is 3.8 miles from Bill and Lois's house. Not that I've checked it out. But maybe. So I called a friend. I said, what do I do about this? He goes like, well, why don't you look it up? I'm going like, it's an anonymous program. And he goes, Google it, dude. What do you got to lose? I said, yeah, that's true. Well, my last name is spelled kind of uniquely, and my grandfather's profession was a judge. And I Googled it, and something came up. And I'm sure a lot of you know about AA history. There's, Bill got sober, then Bill and Bob meet. Then they, get together, write the big book, and then they get the article in the Saturday Evening Post, and everything goes viral. Well, there was some other stuff that went on there. A lot of you may know about the Rockefeller dinner. Bill and Bob connected up with J.D. Rockefeller, who was going to shower all this money on AA to help them spread it because he was real big into fighting alcoholism. And at the last moment, Rockefeller decided not to give them money, which the historians I've read said that was a very good thing, and probably why we're all here today. But what he did do is he said, tell you what, I'm going to host a dinner for you, and you guys can talk to all my closest friends about and acquaintances about this alcoholism cure you guys seem to have. So, he invited 400. I think 80 showed up. Well, when J.D. Rockefeller hosts a dinner, anytime, much less about alcoholism, it makes the papers. And in the entertainment section, or whatever they called it, the social section, they had a list of attendees. And my grandfather was there. Now, that's not proof. But I choose to believe that that's accurate. And I realize my grandfather died 4 months after I was born. But I firmly believe stuff he did for, I don't know, he maybe was sober 20 years, 25 years, I have no idea. The only other story I know is that my sister was talking to my grandma about it once, and she said, oh yeah, after he died, those AAs came to get his books, but I told them I'd already thrown them out. I'm like, anyway, I always wondered why I didn't know about this stuff earlier, but if I had known about this coming into recovery, I would have been sitting there going like, yeah, my grandfather helped start this organization, which would have been very annoying to you and very bad for me. So I think God waited to it because I realized that my grandfather did stuff that I like to believe transitioned into me, Al-Anon being available in Richmond, Virginia, not once, but twice when I needed it. Well, if that's true, won't it be there for my niece and nephews when they need it? And you guys will be there. So what do I have to worry about? And I can be around them now. And that there's a little story that I've heard. A guy named Danny Hellis, he's a futurist. He talks about the internet. And whenever he speaks, he always tells this story, and it really kind of brings home the point. So I'd like to share that with you now. And this is the story. I think of the oak beams in the ceiling of College Hall at New College, Oxford. Last century, this was in the 1900s now. Last century, when the beams needed replacing, carpenters used oak trees that had been planted in 1386, when the dining hall was first built. The 14th century builder had planted the trees in anticipation of a time hundreds of years in the future when the beams would need replacing. I sense that I'm alive at a time of important change, and I feel responsibility to make sure that the change comes out well. I plant my acorns knowing that I will never live to harvest the oaks, but I have hope in the future. I've learned a shorthand in this fellowship for that, and we call it pass it on. I'd like to thank you for letting me pass on my story today.